Tēnā koutou katoa and good afternoon. Welcome to Link University for the State of the Land Bioeconomy series. My name is Grant Edwards and I'm the Vice Chancellor here at Te Whare Wanaka Aoraki Link University, and it's a real pleasure to have you here today. This series is delivered in partnership with the Bioeconomy Science Institute, bringing together researchers, industry leaders and policymakers and communities to explore some of the most significant opportunities and challenges facing Aotearoa New Zealand land-based sectors. Today's discussion focuses on agricultural economics and the critical role it plays in shaping the future of New Zealand's bioeconomy. Agriculture sits at the heart of our economy, our communities, and our international reputation. Yet the sector is operating in an increasingly complex environment, influenced by climate change, evolving consumer expectations, global market dynamics, trade relationships, and changing policy settings. Understanding the economic drivers behind these challenges and the opportunities they create is essential if we are to build farming systems that are both productive and sustainable. This session will explore how economic research is informing decisions across the agricultural landscape, from farm systems and land choices through to trade, climate policy and resource management. It will also examine how economic thinking can be integrated with scientific research and innovation to support the development of a thriving bioeconomy. We're fortunate today to have two highly respected experts in the field. First of all, Dr. Susie Greenhalgh, Group Principal Scientist at the Bioeconomy Science Institute. Susie is an environmental economist with extensive experience in resource management, climate change policy, freshwater management, and sustainable land use. Joining today from Link University is Dr. John Saunders. John is a leading agricultural economist whose work focuses on forecasting agricultural production and markets through advanced economic modelling. Together, John and Susie bring a wealth of experience and insights into the economic forces shaping New Zealand's agricultural future and the opportunities available to support productive, sustainable, and a resilient bioeconomy. What we do in these sessions, we have Susie up first, who will be followed by John. They'll each do short presentations of about 15 minutes. Then we have an opportunity for a facilitated discussion around and questions from the floor also. Please join me in first welcoming Susie.
Thanks, Grant, and it's really nice to be here. I'm just checking this is what I need, where I need to stand. Katie said that I have to stand here and not move. So when I look really weird and stuck, it's because I'm not moving because she told me I couldn't. But thank you very much for coming today. We're playing hopefully a bit of a tag team in the climate change space. We had a bit of a chat a week or so ago and said, what should we talk about? Because it's really weird to have two disconnected talks. And so you've got me coming first, talking a little bit more about on the greenhouse gas emissions and reduction side, and then you've got John sort of moving into that adaptation space. So I'm going to talk a little bit today sort of around trade, but only a tiny bit. Then moving sort of into the public and customer expectations, and then sort of moving into what are the implications for the agricultural sector in here. So just a little bit of a sort of a heads up so that we're all in the same space. When we think about New Zealand's agricultural sector, we want to know where we're selling our commodities. And when we look at the milk sector and you look at these charts, you see that most of our the country that buys the most of our stuff in terms of milk, whether it's milk powder or dairy final products, is actually China and the rest of Asia. So I just want you to keep that in mind. When we start to look at the meat sector, it's a very similar story, except within the beef sector, it's China and the US that are our biggest customers. And then in the lamb and mutton section, it's actually China and Europe. So just keep those in mind. These are the countries that purchase our goods. Now, we want these countries to keep on purchasing our goods. So that's going to really mean that we've got to make sure our consumers, the consumers in those countries are really quite happy and still want to purchase our goods. So when you start looking at some of the analysis and surveys that are being done out in the world there, if you look in the top, the top section just here, This is a survey that was looking at how different countries in Asia feel about environmental disasters. And, you know, unless we change our habits, are we actually going to get there? And what you see there is that's a surprisingly large number of folks that are really worried about environmental disasters. Then there's another survey down here, and that's sort of looking at how much people would be willing to give up of their income to actually fight climate change. Again, when you look at, when you look at China, here, Europe, I'm sorry, the US, will just leave that to one side. They're a bit different for many reasons. But you start to get a feel that actually there's a lot of consumers out there that are really concerned about climate change and might start thinking about where they purchase their products. This is another sort of analysis and survey that was done out here. And I want you to focus on this orange line here. And this is an aggregate of about 32 different countries. But this is what people think in terms of, does my government have a clear plan for how business, government, and individuals will tackle climate change together? That's a really disturbing trend, and it's really low. So we start to see that actually people are worried about this. Now, this is actually something that shows New Zealand a little bit. And so before that, this slide over here is an aggregate. This here is the aggregate. That you look at this line here, and this is a percent of people that disagree with the statement, my country is being asked to sacrifice too much in order to tackle climate change. So there's a lot of people that think we're not really doing enough, and this is the one we need to be listening to. That's the next generation. So with that backdrop, I'd like to then turn to these are the companies that buy our goods, our agricultural goods. These are all food companies around the world, and these have all taken net zero carbon targets. So this means that they've set a target to reduce their emissions to net zero by whatever year. Often it's about 2050. Now, all of these have also taken a commitment to also account for their scope 3 emissions. So scope 3 emissions is climate change or greenhouse gas accounting jargon, and it basically means they're all the emissions upstream and downstream of a company. And of course, agricultural emissions in a food and fibre company or processing company means that agricultural emissions are all in their supply chain. And so they mightn't be asking for it now. They're certainly sending signals that they want to know what the greenhouse gas emission profiles of the products they purchase or the commodities they purchase. So they've made those signals. They might not get them there, but a lot of our processing companies are realizing this is what we need to do, and they're trying to get what those emissions are. So what we have is we've got consumers and customers starting to demand accountability around greenhouse gas emissions. And we as a country need to think about how we respond to that. So let's turn to farmers and what they think about climate change. And I'm going to share with you some results from our survey of rural decision makers that was undertaken last year. So the survey of rural decision makers is a survey of New Zealand's farmers and lifestyle block owners. It's done every 2 years. And so we have a really nice sort of history of how farmers' perceptions around different topics and issues and how the actions they take over since about 2013. So what I want to show you is this one here. And so this is the results, as I said, from 2025. And this is the number of farmers that believe that climate change is occurring. And that's the number here, it's 69%. So there's still 31% of farmers that don't believe climate change is occurring or is real. This is split by, quite a big difference across the industries, where forestry, a lot more of them believe climate change is real. But you get to arable and dairy and there's a lot less. The disturbing thing is that in 2021, it was quite different. So between 2021 and 2025, there's been a 19% decrease in the number of farmers that believe climate change is occurring. And so that's the backdrop that we're sort of heading towards or we're against. Of those people that said they believe in climate change or believe climate change is happening, we also asked a question of whether they believe their land use that they currently have would still be viable on their land if climate changed as they expected. And interestingly, kiwi fruit growers are the most concerned. down to forestry is not so worried. They think they can grow trees anywhere. Doesn't matter what the climate is. But kiwi fruit is certainly worried. And that's a major commodity for us. And we do know that kiwi fruit industry is looking at where else they should be purchasing land and where they should be moving. So they've been quite proactive in that space. So that's sort of what farmers are actually believing. Then we sort of thought, well, let's think about asking what farmers are going to do about things. So the first one we asked is, do you know your greenhouse gas number? Not unsurprisingly, dairy was about 72%. There's been a really big push between Dairy and Z, Fonterra and various other companies to help dairy farmers know what their number is. But we look at sheep and beef, it's only about 19%. So it is quite low and they've got quite a ways to go in that space. Then we asked them, okay, so in terms of what you're trying to focus on in the next 2 years, and what have you focused on in the last 2 years? Sort of this list of different issues, where have you put your time and where do you think you're going to put your time and resources? And when we look at greenhouse gas emissions, it's a pretty low priority. So again, we're seeing a signal that the farming community, the farmers themselves, haven't yet grasped that there's going to be a lot of things they might need to do to try and make sure we stay ahead of the game in terms of access to market. So one of the things that we've been trying to do over time is to make sure that we have options for farmers in terms of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And that is one of the reasons why we've been so slow in taking action in this particular space. And so we know that there's, over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, there's been a massive investment in greenhouse gas technologies. And everyone's just assuming, oh, it's great, we're going to have these technologies, people are going to take them up, or farmers are going to take them up. But we thought we really should ask what factors would actually influence their thinking about taking things up. Now, when I was at a conference not too long ago, everyone firmly believed it was only productivity. That was the name of the game, productivity. And what you see actually is, sorry, I've given them the wrong PowerPoint. When you look up here, it's actually negative effects on animal welfare. Now, this was done in 2025. This is before all the hoo-ha around what's happened in Denmark. So people might be familiar that Denmark actually has taken action. They've got some very strong rules in place around trying to reduce their agricultural emissions. And part of that is requiring a feed additive to be added to all feed. Now, what's happened most recently is they're starting to see some animal productivity, but importantly, animal welfare impacts of that particular technology. And they're in a real quandary now because there's a requirement that they have to have, I think it's 60% of their feed of this additive has to be added to their feed. And of course, now there's people trying to go, oh, I've got problems with my animals, I'll drop it down to 20 and try and build it back up. But they are now out of compliance with their regulation. So there's been some interesting things that have happened globally where if we ask this question today, it might be even more worrying because there is, the word is out that this feed additive, which is one of the ones that's available here in New Zealand, is having some adverse effects. Now, the other thing that I think is quite interesting about this particular piece of data is that we quite often hear from not the farmers, but from others that if you want the farmers to do anything, they have to be paid. It's all about how much we're going to give them the funding. And there was a Radio New Zealand sort of a rural news thingy the other day where they were exactly saying that, every other country pays for their farmers to do things. That's what we have to do here. In New Zealand, it's if we did by percentages, this is like about 80%. This drops down to about 22%. Of farmers believe you need to be paid. And when you ask farmers the reason why, they go, we're not going back to those days where we might lose our subsidies and having to rely on subsidies. So there's still a little bit of a memory about what it was like to have subsidies and to be without subsidies. Because unfortunately our average age of farmers is about 65. And so they've got fairly long memories. So that's just sort of a heads up in this particular space of like, okay, so if we are going to have these technologies, if they're going to be adopted, what are the kinds of things that we have to think about and how do we actually have to talk to farmers around that? I'm going to switch into my last little bit before I hand over to John. And this is some very recent work that we've done. And we were trying to look at, well, what would have happened if we'd sort of started taking some actions in 2012? versus if we delay some of that action. And so this is looking at our journey towards achieving methane reduction targets. And I'm just going to explain this chart first of all, because I think it might be easier. So down here is our methane reduction targets. So we originally had targets where we were going to reduce emissions by about 24 to 47%. That's been recently reduced to about 14 to 24%. Now the 10% is relates to the fact that by 2030 we were going to have a 10% reduction in methane emissions. And so what we were looking at here is what is the cost of achieving these particular targets in 2012. And we had two scenarios. One was where we had a combined target. So together, sheep and beef just had to meet 10%. We also had a target where we said, well, what happens if sheep and beef meet 10% and dairy have 10%? So we split them between the two. And so what you do see is that, yes, it's a little bit more expensive, etc., but that's not what we really wanted to show. What we wanted to really know is that because we decided to hold off and we think about putting sort of actions in place in, say, 2020, we still haven't got actions, but that was sort of some of the thinking there, that what would the cost difference be? And so in this particular case, we have assumed that there is no technologies in place because there weren't any. But one of the reasons why we hadn't taken action back in 2012 is because we were waiting for technologies to be here. And so when you do the same analysis again, but you add in technology. So these are the technologies that are available. Sorry, they're not available. They are almost available for farmers to use at some cost. And we've used costs and effectiveness that have been provided by government agencies. And what you see is, yes, it does reduce the cost, but actually it's still quite a lot higher than if we'd taken early action. And part of that is because what's happened in the interim is that we've had a very large difference in our agricultural sector. There's been a growth in certain sectors and there's been a decrease in others. So when we think about, yes, let's, putting in place policy, we also have to think about if we don't put it in soon enough, then what other additional costs might there be on us? And again, you'll see that it's a little bit more expensive with between the combined and the separate targets. Now, the difference between those two, there's also sectorial differences in who bears the greatest burden. I'm not even going to go into those guys, but I just tell you that there is quite a big difference between those. So just in quick summary, in terms of what we need to think about is we've got our consumers and our major trading companies are really worried about climate change. These are the people that are going to be demanding our products or not demanding our products in the future. In turn, our customers are also increasingly concerned about that. They've told us that once, they've told us again, they are concerned. And then we've got the belief in climate change is actually decreasing a bit with New Zealand farmers. And how does that reconcile with the fact that our customers and consumers are actually increasingly concerned about climate change? Our farmers are also saying that the actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are lower priority than a lot of other issues that they might like to deal with. Again, we've got a real, we need to think about how we turn that around. And then lastly, this delaying of taking actions to reduce our emissions is actually increasing our costs in the long term. And with that, I'll hand it over to John.
Hello, everyone. How you all doing? Good? Yeah, fine. Well, I think it was a good talk, to be fair, so I get it. So hi, everyone. I'm Dr. John Saunders from the Commerce Division. It's absolutely fantastic to be here. Thank you so much for coming along to hear a bit about the wonderful and exciting word of agricultural economics. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we're at. Throwing things away, we're so excited with the talk. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the research we've done around adaptation and resilience and what that might mean for New Zealand agriculture. So where are we now? S2, you stupid agricultural economist. What are we paying for, you moron? Well, no, okay. In the world, what's the situation with agriculture? So is it a great time to be an agricultural economist? We've got war, oil shocks, any more reasons to get an EV or think about changing our energy policy? Changing pressures of disease, weeds, pests. We've got the biggest El Nino year that's going to cause droughts and everything across the world. There's war. We have insurance for some of the extreme events for now, but who knows? John, be an agricultural economist. I thought I'd just sit in a field and count a cow or something like this. Not this. This isn't going on. So 2 years ago, I gave a talk complaining about our agricultural policy around greenhouse gases in New Zealand. So this was 2024, and I said maybe changing our minds so much about what we were going to do and going back and forth was a bit like Morris dancing, you know, in the out, we shake it all about sort of thing. That might not be the greatest policy setting. Yeah. Then I said, what can we do? Well, we keep wanting science to solve all our problems. Well, we don't fund science. We're below here against the OECD average. And at the time, in 2024, we were cutting a bunch of people from government. So bad science system, cutting people from government. And I thought, thankfully, everything's changed since then. And bollocks. Right. Well, I thought, okay, I can't give the same talk again, even though the same messages are true. So we'll talk about some other things about what's changed and what the situation is. Anyone heard of a CBAM? Kabam? Kabloom? A bit onomatopoeic. So a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So the EU's put one in. The EU is going to tax imports coming in depending on how much carbon they took to make. And we've got a little puzzle for you here. So imports come in, they declare the emissions, surrender, bad word, that means you pay money. Yeah? If importers can say, hey, the emissions were already paid for when it was made, you don't have to pay money. Keen-eyed viewers, what's the difference between who gets to keep the money in these situations? Would you prefer to enrich the EU? I like them, they're fine, they make good cheeses, thank you very much. Or would you rather keep the money yourself because you have an emissions pricing policy? You know, maybe we're just that generous. Okay, so the financial component, the surrendering, hasn't started yet for next year, okay? At the moment, we're safe. Oh, phew. It's iron, steel, cement, fertilizers, which will, of course, affect agriculture, electricity and hydrogen. So, we don't have to worry about it. Everyone go to sleep. Oh, no. They're going to update this in 2030 and think about other things. People have said the high value emissions intensive agriculture, beef and dairy, could come up for grabs in the next round of what this could look like. Do we care about the EU? Nah, sod them, right? They're nothing to do with us. Oh, bugger. We've just signed an FTA with them and we're trading quite a lot and we're quite happy about this at the moment, right? So they're an important market for us. So this matters to us if they change their policy around emissions. Well, it's just the EU. We've got other friends. So if one person puts this policy in where they say, if you don't sort out your emissions, we'll do it for you. Well, everyone else is going to say, that's a great idea. And you'll have a domino effect, right? Everyone will put one in to mirror it because they want the benefits of this, not handing over money to the EU. Can you imagine Nigel Farage saying, yeah, that's fine, let's let the EU take the money? Well, actually, can you imagine Nigel Farage doing any climate policy whatsoever? Maybe not. So the UK's thinking about one. Australia's had a big government review and said, we recommend this. They're going to consider that soon. Canada is thinking about mirroring, you know, the EU's one, say, okay, we'll do what they're doing and get the same benefits, prepare our market. Even the US is talking about this. And the US's one's mad where they're saying, let's just get money if anyone tries to send us beef, you know. So it's not just even the EU, one of our incredibly important markets. So if all of even just these markets implemented that, they make up 30% of our agricultural exports, right? So we can't keep hiding behind China, who knows, might think, yeah, this is a great idea. So it's something we can't just dodge. Okay, so you say, even if they do, hypothetical, should we be worried? We're great. And we are. We're emissions efficient. We're pretty good. We got pasture. So here's New Zealand, lowest carbon footprint of milk. Way, we won. Everyone go home. Congratulations. Big pat on the back. Okay. Ah, bugger. Are we really the best? So maybe we'll look at someone else's statistics. So here's the 10 largest producers of beef, and New Zealand thrown in there. Greenhouse gas efficiency for every bit of beef you make. You can see over time. So 2023 in the light green, 2010. So we're all getting better, other than Australia. I don't know what happened to them in 2023. Everything went wrong and they spilled crude oil on all their beef, presumably. But we can see we're middle of the pack. We're not the highest performer in beef. Okay, well, who cares about beef? Well, we look to milk. We're middle of the pack, right? There's other The US, how did that happen? How did we let that happen? Okay. So there's two different measures. So what? We can count it up differently. And to be honest, I'd go with the first one. That was a more detailed and, good study, right? But who's to say what regulator's going to pick? If there's different ways to count it up, why wouldn't you pick the way of counting it up that suits your narrative better? That says, actually, the one which says the US is the most efficient, I think we'll go with that. And anyone who's less efficient than that will have to pay at the border. Okay? As Susie pointed out, a lot of our suppliers are already waking up to this. A lot of our industry is waking up to this. Fonterra has an ambition. Now, if I ordered something online, great, ordered some Pokemon cards, I don't know, whatever interest, I don't know. My daughter's very into them at the moment, I should say. And I got an email from the shop and it said, we have an ambition to deliver this to you. Would I feel reassured? No, I don't want an ambition, just do the thing. Just do the thing, get the ambitions down. So ambition is a bit of a fluffy word, Recently, Fonterra sold its whole brands division and food service to Lactalis, a French giant dairy conglomerate, and returned $3.2 billion to farmer shareholders. Great, wonderful. What problem could I have with that? Well, as Susie pointed out, if you're a farmer, what incentive would you have to invest that into mitigation technology? Invest that in something that'll help lower your emissions. It's not on their interest. That was a very low percentage, right? So to create some change, we've got some wonderful technologies, some developed in Lincoln that can just really reduce your emissions, but it costs a little money, right? So you'd need an incentive to do it, some policy that says this is a good idea, and you'd need a little bit of money. Well, we've just returned a little bit of money to all our farmers, but we've had nothing in place. So what do you think? Are they going to buy the wonderful technology that's really efficient, help their greenhouse gas, or the Ranger? Well, and really what's probably happened, they've paid down a lot of debt, which is a good thing. But as a colleague of mine, Peter Tate, pointed out, well, that might have just been a very big transfer to Australian banks. So good for them. Congratulations on the deal. So emissions pricing helps incentivize. It doesn't have to be big amounts, but it gives farmers a reason to invest. If we're choosing where we're going to invest, it gives incentives. So what can we do? Let's talk about some other specifics about what's happening with climate change and what research says. So the IPCC says we're going to have more extreme weather events, droughts, floods, cyclones, and they're going to be more intense. Okay? That's going to lead to more volatility in pricing, and it's going to have more food insecurity across the world. This is a graph I love to trot out for a long time. Here's the overall index of food prices. For the longest time, we're getting more and more efficient, and we're reducing food costs for the world. Brilliant. Less people impoverished, less people starving, right? Until around the 2000s, that trend changed. And we got articles like the end of cheap food, right? Why was that? Increased volatility, climate change, these spikes, droughts and other climate activities exacerbated by people betting on the agricultural markets as well, right? So that was a little while ago. How are we doing now? Well, after these two big spikes, 2020, we've got COVID, a war in Ukraine, a massive grain supplier, but we're still, guess what, trending up. So maybe it is that we're in a whole new pricing environment, which is more volatile and increasing. And we can pack that in and say, well, good luck if you want to buy some oil, but maybe we'll be able to have some chocolate because sugar prices are going down. So, some good news in amongst it all, maybe. Okay, so here's this happy looking fella. Look at that, with the plants, my only true friends, Also, slightly more sensible haircut. Now, if I said I'd be too busy doing world-class research to get a haircut, would you believe me? Would that be? No? Okay. I'll try another line next time. So I was very fortunate, and that's why I'm so stoked, to be the guest editor of a special focus on this topic, on extreme weather events and what we can do. It had papers for some real heavy hitters here. The OECD, the EU's Joint Research Council, Fabric, EFRI, these are the big players in agricultural economics, right? And they all contributed papers on this issue, right? They examined all the impacts of these extreme weather events on different parts of the economy in different countries. And they all came to that conclusion, we're entering a more price volatile world, which is bad for everyone. Less certainty, more one-off disasters with starvation. What was the main thing that they concluded would help across all of these cases? Anyone who's already read ahead in the top right corner might not be a surprise, but trade. Trade was the saving grace. That's the thing we can do. We can be more integrated globally, and that can smooth over these volatilities. If someone has a domestic event, or there's several domestic events, being able to trade will get us out of those shortages. Global cooperation allows us to compensate for use, not the sheep, even though we're in Lincoln, you know, that's extreme weather event. So with integrated trade, the risk of high food prices is mitigated, leads to less severe declines in food availability compared to if trade was restricted. Trade integration plays a vital role in stabilizing food supplies during extreme yield shocks. That's fancy, boring economics terms for we've just had a flood and everything's caught fire. Yeah. So, luckily, everything's fine in trade, so that'll be no problem whatsoever. We can all rest easy. It's a great time for trade, no problems. Oh, bollocks. So, Trump steps in and makes for a very sad economist, right? All of these big tariffs, blanket tariffs, less integrated trade. But then the Supreme Court said that illegally wasn't allowed to do those in the first place. Happy economist. Oh, bollocks, he's coming up with some fabricated reason around labor laws to make it sad again, you know. So either way, it seems like the US is hell-bent on causing more trade wars and trying to block trade integration. So it's a bad time globally for this thing, which is our saving grace with extreme events. Yeah. What else? Well, as Susie said, you know, zestberry and kiwi fruits worried about the growing area. So here's a chart saying the suitable areas of growing for Sauvignon Blanc, you know, the most important commodity for soccer mums in the world. So, and we can see here, darker, bad, yellow, good. So some of the areas we can grow the stuff changes, but that's a huge, massive restructuring problem, right? But we have the research to say where these things might change. So some places are getting better, others worse. It's not just horticulture. Our dairy industry is going to suffer because pasture and ryegrass is impacted. I have my wonderful co-authors up there, Anita and Micah. This is a paper we did looking at a bunch of different ways the future of our dairy industry will be impacted. So we did things like droughts, global livestock heat stress, and did sort of international modeling to see what happens based on our markets. I'm not going to worry about that one much, but just to give you a teaser if you did want to check the paper for some of those facts. We did the most amazing thing. We took climate projections, put them through a pasture model, put them through farm level models, put them through Dairy NZ's dairy sector pathways model, put them through our trade and environment model, and then put them through an input output model. It was a busy week. But from all of that, we could say what's going to happen when this dip in pasture happens, right? And what we found by the end of the century, each year the dairy industry would have to put its hand in their pocket to the cost of $4.7 billion if we were operating as we were now. That's the feed cost to replace what would be lost in our dairy industry. Has anyone got, you know, $4.7 billion lying on a shelf at home they could help out with? It's serious money, right? Yeah. So what's our opportunity? Well, we've got alternate pastures. So there's a bunch of different things we can pivot to rather than ryegrass that are a bit more heat tolerant, might take less irrigation, that could save some of the gap. So with full adaptation, the same scenario, that 4.7 billion goes down to 600 million. It's still not chump change, but the difference is amazing, isn't it? Yeah. So this is why we should be looking at adaptation and helping farmers along this journey, right? Cool. Well, maybe we give up on dairy, right? If it's all going bad, stuff it. We'll figure out something else to do. Bananas. Sorry, it's just such a fun word to say in any situation. I don't mean getting a bit dire with climate change, so let's just say bananas. So Northland's already suffering these deficits with ryegrass, so they're looking at alternate novel crops. So we did a paper, and this is with my other co-author, Peter Tate, up the back there. Thanks, Peter. Where we went over to Australia. And I know things are bad if we're having to look to Australia for hints, isn't it? But that's how bad climate change is. So we went to look at their production systems. And you can see they're dealing with these changing growing zones. So this red bit bleeding down. And so the tip of New Zealand's slowly going to look a bit like, you know, this east coast of Australia at some point. So we figured out we could kind of grow it. But this is where the market's important when we're looking at these things. We can mimic the production system as best we can. See how to do it. This is the landed cost of a kg of bananas in New Zealand. Less than $2, about $1. That's with transport and everything. per kg. That's how cheaply bananas are made and exported to New Zealand, right? So that's who we're competing against, places which are incredibly labor intensive for a very labor intensive product. Are we labor intensive? No, we're not labor intensive, we're capital intensive, and we struggle to get seasonal workers to help do this sort of thing. So we did a report, you could look it up as well, saying, well, we can't compete directly on price, but is there a higher value functional version of a banana that we could do that would make sense in a market? And so we went out, surveyed consumers, and found out there was the opportunity to get premiums for certain beneficial things we could do in New Zealand. So we could have this high performance, high value version of bananas that wouldn't be competing one for one with a super low cost Cavendish coming in, but it's its own domestic thing that's a high functional food. So this is where New Zealand could play a part, right? In the same way Zespri's distinguished itself from a common Kiwi, you know? Cool. Still competing with low cost Cavendish banana, yep. Also, if we're thinking about novel crops, there was a huge amount of misinformation. Growers being told the wrong things, wrong returns to get, the wrong locations to set up this. It was very particular where you had to grow and the conditions to make it work in New Zealand. So how can we help? Better information, learning from people, knowledge transfer. We brought over an expert from Australia. It's probably the best thing we did on the project. Talk to growers and tell them what was going wrong and dispel some of this misinformation and bring over some of the great materials and resources they had for growers. In another previous project, we'd created a GIS thing. So if you're a horticulturist or a viticulture grower, you could look up your exact location and it could tell you your changing disease risk and how much that would change with climate change over time. So if you're thinking of establishing a new vineyard, you could look up your address and get information. So this is stuff the research is doing and we can do to help inform growers. Yep. But then even if this worked, even if we had this wonderful banana industry, bananas that, you know, we managed to get across and we completely replaced, so the only bananas anyone in New Zealand ate was the domestically grown good New Zealand special bananas. That would be worth $1.3 million every year. What were dairy product exports in 1 year? Right, even if we said just Northland, just concerned about Northland. Well, if we took Northland's percentage of that, so the numbers, we should still look at these novel industries and opportunities we have, but nothing's replacing dairy in a short term, right? So we still need to think about this massive thing. So we shouldn't lose sight of our strengths. So that's our dairy and as a country. So one last thing I'd like to leave everyone with. What are our national strengths as a country? And so there's a Maori legend that some of you may know, or some of you may have better versions of, but just humour me. So Tane Mahuta, the god of the forest, is going through the forest and he notices all the trees are dying, you know. Being the god of the forest, that's generally a bad thing, you know, bad stewardship, I suppose, but, you know. The insects were everywhere, crawling over this. So a classic climate change problem, you know, pest control, right? So what does he do? Well, he goes to all these native birds. Who's going to come down to the forest floor and help eat all these insects to save the forest? What happens? All the birds come back. Now, imagine me on a Friday afternoon when someone comes in my office and says, John, I have something really important you need to help me out with right now. And I say, oh, I'm so busy. I couldn't possibly. Is that the time? Oh, I've got every excuse in the world will come out of my mouth at that time so I can get down to Staff Club and have a beer, right? That's just human nature and apparently bird nature. So all the birds come out and say, no, I couldn't possibly. Oh, no, I've got to go fishing that day. Oh, no, sorry, I'm the guy that cleans the leaves. You know, I couldn't possibly do it. So everyone says, thank you, but no thank you to this wonderful opportunity. Except for the Kiwi. The Kiwi says yes. And Tane Mahuta says, you'll lose your wings, you'll lose your colourful feathers, and you won't have any of that anymore. The Kiwi still says, yeah, no, I'm in. So the Kiwi lost its ability to fly in order to save the forest and became most loved and valued of all the birds. Yeah. And that's our national icon. Yeah. We're Kiwis, not ostriches, right? We should be proud of that fact. So delaying and pretending this stuff isn't happening, that's not getting us anywhere. That's not who we are. That's not what we should be proud of being, you know. So we've got this situation where this bird does something a bit brave, right? Says, hey, look, it could be that there's some cost, but this is something that needs to happen and we need to get behind. Previously, I would have said there's a win-win. If we act first, we can get a premium for it. You know, we do this hard, fast, best because we have to eventually. And then we sell that to our markets, we help that pay the way. We're losing that opportunity. Other countries are doing this already. We're losing our opportunity to be that one. So there's still time, but it's slipping away. And as Susie says, the longer we wait, the more costly it's going to be. Anyone who's saying, we don't need this, this is a cost to farmers, this is bad for farmers to do this, they're setting those farmers up to fail. And they're setting those farmers up for a very rude awakening that will happen like that, right? Rather than a chance to slowly adapt and let the farmers decide. We've put incentives in place. You can decide how to get them. You can decide which technologies work for you and your thing. We've given you the time and incentives, the framework to be able to change. So I just ask that we can be like the Kiwi, can we be brave with some of this adaptation, climate resilience and carbon pricing and become this beloved national icon. So, and then one last thing I'll leave you with. We do some stuff occasionally. So again, with a wonderful team of people at Lincoln, we've just released this report looking at land use change and changing climate for New Zealand. So looking forward, it's evident that Aotearoa New Zealand need to explore alternative land use, shift towards climate resilient crops, pastures, as we saw, and animals, and integrate innovative practices to maintain productivity while minimizing environmental impacts of production. Policymakers, land managers, and farmers must work collaboratively to ensure that future land uses not only meet economic demands, remember the market, you've got to check what the market actually wants, not just make something for the best, but also contribute to long-term ecological sustainability in a rapidly changing climate. So this is the thing we hope to aspire to. So let's all go on that journey together and try and not hit that cliff rather than the staggered growth. So thank you very much for listening and having us along, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you very much, John and Susie, for those insightful presentations there, particularly looking at climate adaptation and the economics associated with that. I'm going to lead off with a question, but before you can jump in and then ask some questions. And I think it's in relation to what you both alluded to, is that you got the global markets and climate change influencing what happens on New Zealand farms, and things like consumer preferences and trade regulations all coming into it at this point in time. What do you reckon? How well positioned are we actually at this point in time to respond to these things? Because it's quite a leading question, but are we really well positioned as we think right at this moment to these things?
I think we're not. And the reason why I think we're not well positioned is because I think there's a lot of rhetoric out there that is doing a disservice to the farmers. And I'm going to say the farmers, not the agricultural sector. And there is quite a big difference there. And when farmers are hearing a lot of stuff that might be quite contradictory, there's a lot of noise out there, so they don't know what to believe. And so when you don't know what to believe, you tend not to do anything. And so I think that we really need a very clear direction of travel, that farmers go, aha, all right, now I know what I need to do, and then how do I actually plan to do that? And so I do believe that our industries and our government and even us as researchers need to be actually singing from the same song sheet, so that we provide that clear direction of travel that we know farmers need to hear, so that they can think about how to make change. When we think about ourselves and we go, oh, we're going to make a change, we don't make it overnight. We sit down and think, oh, I need to replace my heater now, so then I'll think about a more efficient one, or I'll change to electric cars when this car's dying. We have to think about what that transition period is and how long that might take, and give farmers that time to do that. Unfortunately, we've had an awful long time to do that, and they've heard conflicting messages, and so most of them haven't made the steps that are probably needed to do.
I can't really top such a brilliant answer that I agree with totally, but I just add the kind of irony is we were really well placed. We like we saw We are an efficient producer. We were kind of set up to, we were the first developed nation that had such a large part of its climate, emissions coming from agriculture. It was going to hit us before anyone else who dealt with their energy and transport sectors. So as part of these, so we were perfectly placed to be the ones who could take leadership on this and front foot it. But of course now, as Susie says, we're a bit behind the buck.
And just while you're thinking of some questions, a further question to you, what is looking ahead of the next 10 to 20 years? What is that one policy change that you could give direction to perhaps make that would really have the greatest impact on bioeconomy? You go.
Well, and you might have came across subtly in my talk. People are afraid of pricing, right? They see pricing as an additional cost to the farmers, right? Go, oh no, we're just pricing ourselves out. Well, we've seen the reasons why that isn't necessarily the case with the trading environment, but economists think of that pricing as embodying what was already going on in the first place, right? There was an externality. There was climate damage that was happening that no one was paying for, and so of course you ended up with bad outcomes. All we're trying to do is align incentives so those are taken into account for. And again, most of these policies have started off with a very low amount. Oh, but what if it increases? Well, no, we just want to have an amount in there. So there's some incentive. There's some reason when you look at what should I invest in when the heater breaks, and very nice analogy, should it be a more efficient one to climate or just whatever's going? So again, that pricing in one form or another, I think is the policy which economists favor and we think would kind of work. Very low, bleed it in very slowly, so there's time to adapt and change.
For you, Susie?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's necessarily emissions pricing, but it's environmental policy that starts to make a change. And emissions pricing is one example of those. It could be freshwater policy and limits that actually stick, because on the freshwater side, a lot of the things that you might need to do for freshwater are going to have benefits for climate change as well, or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Not so much the other way, because there's a lot of technologies that are climate change specific, but having a policy in the agricultural sector that incentivizes or points to farmers having to think about their environment is going to be really helpful. Now, in reality, what we don't want is these policies to be driving change. We want farmers to be on the forefront of this change and them leading the way, because as we've seen, policy tends to be a bit flip-floppy. And so as a result, if we can also think about what we might need to do, not in the policy space, but in that non-statutory voluntary space, to get farmers to be leading the way, that's probably what we're going to need to do. And in reality, our markets might be the one that kick us in the butt to actually.
Thank you. Opportunity for now for some questions.
2 weeks ago, I finally got published a paper that shows that there is a way of getting our production with no extra thing. And consequent emission, greenland intensity reduction, and positive contributions to our welfare and nitrogen. It took me 12 years from the time I got the data to the time I got it. And it was not because of the farmers' disinterest, institutional resistance and possibly here. So the issues are going to be about how to get the community farmers will do what their customers make to the cost. They don't control what customers do. Now, Fonterra last Friday finally got on board this. To the farmers who take it on because of I went down the list of we took more.
That's
so it's there. It's just about getting it. The biggest problem is getting enough stuff away.
Yeah, perhaps I'm not. It was a comment. I'm not sure if there was a question, but you're happy to.
Well, I mean, I'll just say I'm so glad someone came up with a silver bullet while I was president. It was fantastic. I agree completely, and I think this touches on a couple of really important things, because there are win-wins to be had, and I think exactly that. If we've got something that increases productivity, well, that's good for the farmers in a financial sense, and also reduces your nitrates and your greenhouse gases. So anything we can do there is fantastic. So hopefully we can roll it out. I think the problem I have is often the refrain is, we'll wait for this next bit of technology to come along. And I don't mean technologies like the one you're proposing, which sounds like an easy pickup for farmers, but something that will just say, we can keep doing business as usual and something will save us at the 11th hour. And it's the fact that's done on flimsy science because it's a get out of jail free card that, oh, good, we don't have to do massive structural change on the way we farm and think about really reforming the sector. We just kind of keep doing what we're good at, and then later we'll find some sort of magical technology. But I mean, that sounds incredibly promising, and I hope we can align the stars to help get enough made that if that's a great solution, you know. Well, you'll have to get back to work on the next 12 years, I'm afraid, then.
Further questions, please.
Susie, do you have any data understanding of why that's climate change?
We haven't had a look to see whether we could see anything more broadly across our information, because we've only sort of just put this stuff out, and it was pretty disheartening when we saw that. Actually, I was really surprised. Having said that, I have sat with what I'm going to call everyday farmers over lunch at field days before in areas that we've worked, and the comments being, I actually don't really believe in climate change, but I really kind of I need to do something. And with the change in rhetoric out there about climate change, particularly coming from the United States, that could be enough to have turned some of those farmers that were on the fence, but no, we've got to do something, so let's just do it, to go, no, don't need to anymore. But that is exactly the question that we've asked ourselves. What else can we do to try and work out what might have sort of done that turnaround?
Please.
You can talk about two different issues here. One was greenhouse gas reduction. Second bucket was around that adaptation to the climate. Wonder if the second one's an easy to sell.
Very good summary of my talk. I wish I had you when I was doing the content of my speak. I agree totally, and I think that in terms of the intensity is going to be important for something like a carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? Because that's going to be the grounds on which they're saying you're bringing X amount of product. How much has that been worth in terms of carbon? So that's the reason the intensity is really important, is because that might be the metric we're talking about with any additional tariffs. The other one, which is just our overall emissions, that was kind of, I alluded to a previous talk I'd given, and that was more our commitment to say COP. Right, we've had these international agreements where we've said we're going to reduce our emissions. We promise to get along with everyone. And of course, for us, everyone else has other low-hanging fruit before they come to the hard basket of agriculture. Whereas us and Ireland are kind of in a unique position where, because our energy sector is relatively low emissions compared to a lot of other countries out there, that was something that's kind of our, not elephant cow in the room, if you know what I mean. So we had two different drivers for why we need to deal with climate, but at the end of the day, they sort of look a bit the same. I was in a class and we were dealing with some students, and we gave them the thing, what would you do in a policy situation to reduce emissions by 50% in New Zealand? Now, the lecturer I was helping had the idea that they'd come back and say, it's impossible. Of course, they didn't know Lincoln students. My group of students had come up with some sort of cow death squad that would go out and just cull the half of our cows. And there you go, you want 50% reductions? There you go. So that would solve the second problem, but maybe not in the most optimal way. So yeah, watch out for Lincoln students. On the adaptation front, just quickly, sorry, a long answer I know. Of course, that's more palatable because it's something in, your comment on why can't farmers realize they're at the forefront dealing with these sort of things day to day, that as Susie's stat showed, the kiwi fruit industry is aware of this happening and is making changes. They're seeing this. So of course, if you're saying we're going to help you adapt to the things you're seeing, of course that's more palatable, but it's something we need to deal with on both fronts, I guess. So, yeah, I agree.
An opportunity for one last question.
We're trying to do that really hard at the moment. I've actually, the very first part of the talk that I gave, I've been giving at catchment groups. And actually I'm not getting any backlash whatsoever from farmers. So it's really been quite fascinating. They're going, the last part, sorry. Implementation. Yes, no, that's exactly right. But part of it is getting people to think first. That's the first part, and then it's going to be the implementation. I still think a lot of farmers are really worried on the climate, not adaptation side, but on the mitigation side, that it all relates to me reducing my cattle numbers. And until we've got things that increase productivity and don't have any other negative effects, they don't want to reduce their numbers. The other interesting thing though is when you think about the history of dairy and the realization that as farmers have intensified and moved from like dairy system 2 to dairy system 5, there is now a realization that a lot of farmers at dairy system 5 are actually not making a lot more money. They're probably making less money than those at dairy system 3. And what some of the interesting things, because I lead another large program of work called Moving the Middle, where we talk to a lot of farmers, and it's about trying to get that middle cohort of farmers to take one step to the right in terms of environmental improvement, is that what we've realised is a lot of farmers at the dairy system 5 end are operating on a precipice. The high stress because their grass needs to have grown 2 centimetres today, otherwise they need to really think about bringing in feed, etc. And so I think that there's sort of some well-being aspects that I think some farmers are starting to see, and they're trying to think through, well, what do I need to do to try and get myself off the bandwagon, which could be some of the things about let's not operate at such a high level, which hopefully will start to get that to implementation question you're talking about.
And from my perspective, I'm stuck in an office with a spreadsheet a lot of my day, but on this research, and one of the things I really love about Lincoln, to company bit, is that it's a very applied place. So the research encourages going out to talk to farmers. We do co-design, we try and get out there, we try and survey farmers directly. You want to know, ask them, get them in a room and ask them. And, farmers are very busy and try and make that work. I had 2 examples. One project I was doing about, carbon in the fjords, and they said, you, the economist, will have to get out in the fjords, come down to Doubtful, you need to see it in person. I said, yes, I definitely do. And then another project, it was about sort of looking at, high pathogenic avian influenza. And they said, you, the economist, need to come out to all these chicken farms. And they go, do I really? Do I need to be dragged around these sort of... They're keen to get you out there, and that's what we love, is to go actually see how things work on the ground. It's about co-design and setting up these incentives to let farmers choose what to do, as long as they have options there, like these technologies. As long as they're available, we set up the incentives, talk to them, and they choose how to implement it in a way that's right for them. It needs to be ground up. But great question, thank you.
Susie and John, thank you very much for your presentations today. Agriculture, economic, climate, sustainability. CBAT, that's a new one for me, which I've gone away with and with some fear of, probably, as to what it actually is. But outstanding presentations and really good dialogue here. But thank you very much for your